Great to be here. My name's Nikki Kitson. I'm the product manager for digital product passports at Circulor, including battery passports. And I'm also an alumni of the Battery Associates MBA, along with many of my colleagues. So it's really special to be here today, and it's been an excellent day of panels and sessions so far. So thanks to Battery Associates for putting us on and having us here as well. What we'll be discussing in this deep dive. So I'll start by just introducing Circulor, if you're new to us, who we are, what we do, how we do what we do. And then I'll touch very briefly on the EU battery regulations. I know this is the EU deep dive session and what this battery passport is. But then we'll spend most of the session deep diving into the data that's underpinning the passport. So there has been quite a lot of focus sessions of late increasingly on the regulation requirements, and there needs to be, we all need to understand them and what the battery passport is. But where's all that data coming from? It needs to come from somewhere, and that's what I would love to deep dive with you all today. So Circulor, we're the global technology company providing transparency to complex industrial supply chains. So the leading supply chain traceability solution. We were founded back in 2017, headquartered in London in the UK, but with a global presence all over the world. They're global supply chains after all. And we enable companies, organizations to gain visibility into their supply chains. And this can help, as you can see, demonstrate responsible sourcing, manage supply chain risk, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve ESG performance. We're industry agnostic. However, we have a very strong presence and expertise really in the EV industry. We're helping to lead and shape the market. You can see that by a few of our clients here, big auto OEMs, as well as big battery manufacturers, but also upstream mines as well. We're a neutral third party working with everyone in the supply chain. We've got some really great partners as well, including Battery Associates, Battery Pass, KPMG, Deloitte to help with those consulting services. But we're also part of the network. So we're part of GBA, Surpass, Catena X, Critical Minerals Association, etc., etc. Our tech, Prove, it's our technology suite, and that's what's really helping businesses unlock the supply chain transparency. It's modular, it's flexible, it enables easy starting points. It's a big cliche, but unfortunately it's extremely true. This sort of supply chain traceability, material traceability is a journey. So we have a modular, flexible technology suite to enable that with supply chain mapping, material traceability, which is really what's fundamental and at the core of what we do, able to then track emissions on top of that, gather documents for compliance, track ESG metrics, and of course, my favorite, but I'm biased, the digital product passports. So how we actually provide the end-to-end supply chain traceability at Circulor, we create a reliable, trustworthy digital chain of custody, and that's by tracking the actual material itself as it changes physical and chemical state. So we do this by digitally connecting participants and following the flow of materials from origin through processing, logistics, through manufacturing, all the way to end product. And of course, now tracing the product as it's in life, to getting use updates, all the way through to end of life. So we're tracing materials within facilities and across whole supply chains. And then, as mentioned, once we do this, we're able to add additional data on top, like carbon emissions, getting the energy usage data from facilities, attributing it to the product level. So we've been doing this for a number of years. We've tracked cobalt, we're tracking lithium, nickel, graphite, all familiar critical raw materials for those in the battery industry, hopefully, but also other materials such as leather as well. We are a blockchain-based company, technology, which just allows the immutability of the data. So you can't edit history, you can't edit the records as well. So hopefully you've got a good understanding of who Circulor is, what we do and why, but there's a lot more information on our website or just getting in touch with us. But we can begin the process of deep diving. So firstly, just as I mentioned, would love to just touch on the regulations and the passport itself to help set the scene. I'm not sure entirely who's joining the session, make sure we're on the same page. So the EU battery regulation itself is requiring a more accountable, sustainable, responsible circular value chain as one of its key core aims. And the battery passport forms part of the regulation sitting within Article 65. And that will come into place as of February 2027. And that's for EV, LMT, industrial batteries with a capacity over 2 kilowatt hours. So there's a lot of information about what the battery passport is and what it's helping to do. I know we're in the EU deep dive. There's other regulations coming out of EU, like the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, which is also requiring digital product passports for a range of other industries, textiles, electronics, for example. But then outside of the EU, there's the US Clean Vehicle Tax Credit requiring proof of provenance, proof of recycling in North America. And there's regulations coming out of Japan, India, all involving uniquely identifying a product, either information about where it's been, its manufacturing, proving the provenance, or understanding where it's going, where it's ending up for end of life as well. So we do this, a digital product as digital battery passport. It really is a first of its kind compliance tool, a circular economy enabler, and aiming to unlock value across a full battery life cycle. A couple of images there, desktop, mobile, apps, and some key features. It's uniquely identifiable at an individual item, so an individual battery level, access via a QR code and URL. And as hopefully you're getting the data from the product's entire life cycle, including manufacture, usage, and end of life. And then it's got access control mechanisms, really, really crucial. We are big believers in visibility and transparency, but we've got to balance that with genuine concerns about confidentiality and what users should be seeing, what data is really crucial there. So with role-based access control mechanisms. And then the content and technical design is developed alongside regulations. Hopefully you were able to join the panel earlier with our Chief External Affairs Officer, Ellen Curry, who talked about the battery regulations. So we've got a lot of presence across the network, as you saw before. So we're making sure we're developing in line with this very fast-moving place. But now we can start the deep dive. I think we've got a good chunk amount of time to get into it. As mentioned, a lot of focus on the passport, the regulations, but where does the data come from? It's got to come from somewhere. How can you have trust and confidence in data, specifically when the data points are claims at a product model? How do you prove the data? These sort of questions are what we are hoping to help you understand. So I mentioned at the beginning, there's our Prove technology suite, and we've been doing this, tracing materials for a number of years now. So I'll go through these one by one, but there's the traceability data. So we have key data elements that are required for traceability to ensure we can make that connection between material coming in and outbound material. But it also includes the in-use data, end-of-life data as well. It's not just state of health, there's a lot of data following that material. We've also got our emissions tracking data. So our platform enables the collection of supplier specific data relating more to emissions, energy usage data at the facility, transport data as well. Driving part of the decarbonisation agenda, companies are responsible for their supply chain, their scope 3, what breakdown, my scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, we provide that information. But this emissions tracking data, we'll get onto it, but is a big chunk of the understanding of battery carbon footprint. Then there's data about the product or the battery itself. And we have a product management area on our platform where that data can be entered. But this potentially is the more static related data about the product, which doesn't change. It's the same for all product models. And because this is all very, very new, unfortunately, it doesn't tend to sit in one nice area of master data management inside organizations, companies. It sits in silos, it sits in different formats. I think one day we'll get there, but for now, our product allows you to enter that more manually if you're at that stage. Then there's data about compliance and sustainability or ESG metrics as well. So that can be attributed again at the product level and collected and enabled, and we enable that collection from suppliers. So what I'd like to do is take a look at the actual data attributes. So the EU battery regulation defines all the mandatory data attributes that need to be made accessible via the battery passport. They also define which ones need to be made accessible to the general public, which ones need to be made accessible to interested persons as well, and others. And then the Battery Pass Consortium, who are present here today as well, were on the panel I mentioned earlier, of which Circulor is a member. We are responsible for one of the work packages doing the technical demonstrator. They've done a really excellent job of going through the regulation, grouping all those attributes into these 7 categories you can see in front of you. And if you scan that QR code at the top, you can get directed to the resources page of their website, which has the contents guidance document, but it also has a really excellent Excel workbook, which lists all these different attributes with more information along the columns. So there are about 90 data attributes that are needed from across the whole supply chain. Still a few questions that are left open, but this is where we are at the moment. What I'd like to do is take these 7 categories one by one and talk about where that data is coming from, as well as providing a little bit of context of what it is, but you can find more information about that in the content guidance. So the first group, general battery and manufacturer information, just who manufactured the battery, where and when. This data, the unique ID, is really crucial for the concept of something like the battery passport. It's what allows us, if you think just all of this data here, it allows us to relate all of this different data coming from many different places to one unique ID about the product, which is very exciting. It's also currently quite difficult to obtain on the battery labels, especially for end users. And it can help authorities who may be struggling to track back liability and verify compliance, etc. The first 4 of the attributes are made accessible to the public. Now, we're used to this data. We collect this data through traceability, have been for the last few years, and that involves sort of data about the facility, the manufacturing place, and date as well, timestamping the product as it's finished, the battery pack has finished assembly, even as it goes into a vehicle. So some of this data can also come from the supply chain, as well as being battery category, something that is static across, or the same, sorry, across all batteries. Compliance, labels, certifications. I'll go over this one very briefly. It's just symbols, labels, etc. I think we talk a lot about the battery passport being part of the green transition, but we can't forget it's part of the digital transition, of course, and it's getting a lot of this data that may exist elsewhere digitally, and that includes things like labels as well. The battery carbon footprint is a slightly chunkier one. So while batteries obviously play a really important and exciting part, significant role in the decarbonizing of the energy and transport sector, they do come with considerable embedded carbon emissions, and we want to make sure we're not repeating mistakes of history, or we're just having a very realistic approach to the carbon footprint of the battery, to understanding the product. But this does require a uniform calculation methodology, which is quite tricky, but that will allow it to be comparable as well. So what's actually required on the battery carbon footprint begins with a carbon footprint declaration. Now that's an absolute number, one number for each battery model per manufacturing plant. So if you've got a battery model being made across multiple manufacturing plants, that should come with its own battery carbon footprint, because it has experienced different processes. It might have used different energy from different grids. It's specific to the manufacturing plant. Over time, the regulations get more stringent, and there will be a performance class which the carbon footprint needs to be fitting into, and then eventually there'll also be a maximum threshold in the carbon footprint. So things get more stringent. We already do with our platform carbon emissions tracking for companies to understand their hotspots, understand what's going on in their supply chain in terms of emissions, which is really crucial if we think further than just declaring it, but also having to maybe fit into performance class or make sure we're with the third one, the maximum threshold. Also important to say on this one, it's not just the absolute value. The value must also be differentiated per life cycle stage. So you can see these four across here: raw material and pre-processing, manufacturing, main product manufacturing, distribution, and end of life. And that does require, therefore, primary data from supply chain traceability, because data needs to come from the manufacturing life cycle stage. It needs to be supplier specific data. Great. So,
hey, Nikki.
Yes.
There looks like there's a question from Nathan that's relevant to this slide. Yeah, the battery carbon footprint. So Nathan asks, does the carbon footprint data require a separate auditing process, or is it reliant on self-reporting?
So thanks Nathan, thanks Clara. One important thing to note is this is still kind of reporting as we are, but things are still being finalized specifically on methodologies. So you do need to provide the number, the carbon footprint value, but also a web link to the study. How it's being audited, reported on, I'm not entirely sure, but I can certainly ask our experts internally and get back to you, Nathan. If you want to get in touch with me, I can do that for sure.
And then there's three other questions, actually. I'm not sure whether you want to cover them now or perhaps later in your presentation, Nikki, but one looks like it covers, it's asking about manufacturing information. Another is regarding battery ID. And then another is a question on building batteries in Asia, specifically China. Do you want to cover any of those?
I reckon because they're not directly related to this slide, if I carry on with the deep dive,
sure,
and we can get to them at the end.
Yeah, I'll
please
take note of them.
interrupt me if it's relevant to the one I'm talking about, defo. Sure. Okay, great, thanks. So the next next group is all about supply chain due diligence. So I think, as we all know, today battery materials and components are often fraught with unethical working conditions, negative environmental conditions, effects, on the environment, on societies, or they can be. And although we are really into supply chain traceability, it is still very new. And that does mean that downstream suppliers might not appropriately be able to identify the risks. Let's be frank, a lot of OEMs, organizations don't actually know their supply chain, so don't know where the risks are, don't know if they're associated to them and their materials and their products. So not be able to appropriately identify them, address them, manage them, engage with suppliers about them. It's also an area where there's needs a bit more standardization. There's quite a lot going on in the regulation requirements. But what the EU battery regulation is requiring on a product level, it introduces this due diligence obligations. Now, that's a lot broader than just this one report. As part of it, it also includes setting up, having companies' management systems and risk management plans, but including operating a chain of custody or a traceability system. So it's kind of this ongoing monitoring. But it does also include the due diligence report. And what you can't see, because that's absolutely tiny and it's just loads of rows, within the due diligence report, there's actually a lot of data points. So although it's just a PDF report for the battery passport, there's a lot of data that needs to go into the report. And it does include things like raw material supplier name and address, country of origin, quantity of materials, all things which, if you don't know your supply chain, you're going to have quite a hard time doing that. So it is primary data we're used to collecting as part of material traceability as well. So that report will also be made available to the public. It's one of the data points that is made available to them. There's also a group, maybe we're up to 5, I think now, on all to do with battery materials and composition. So this is data attributes such as battery chemistry, so LFP, NMC, what the critical raw materials are, what the hazardous substances are and their impact, but also materials used in the cathode and the anode, in the electrolyte. And this really aims to help inform several other value chain participants, such as logistics, dismantling, sorting, recycling, who might be finding it difficult currently without this information to assess safe transport requirements, define the value of the battery so then they can know how to segregate it, choose where it goes, choose appropriate handling routes, etc., etc. Again, we're used to collecting this data. This data can come from the supply chain. So what the critical raw materials are, you're collecting and understanding it anyway for the due diligence. So identifying the critical raw materials, but also the materials that are in the cathode, the anode, electrolyte, that's gathered as part of supply chain traceability data too. The 6th big chunky category is all about circularity and resource efficiency. So this includes quite a few different data points, but essentially manuals for battery removal, disassembly and dismantling, component part numbers, spare part information, safety measures, what the extinguishing agent is. But what I like to narrow in and focus on is this 4th one. It's the pre and the post-consumer recycle shares for nickel, cobalt, lithium and lead. So if you like, it's 8 attributes. Now, how do you know the recycled content share of the pre or post-consumer cobalt or lithium in your battery? Again, it's getting to know your supply chain. It's getting to where that data enters, where that material enters the supply chain. So is it entering as a recycled content, recycled material or virgin material? What's the quantity of recycled material to allow you to calculate that share? I previously worked in our implementation team and I've had experience with this, and a few times, although supply chain mapping is an excellent start, if you don't know your supply chain, start by mapping it, a brilliant way to begin. Often the supply chain map we receive and then the data we get once we're doing the traceability don't always marry up. So sometimes it's not actually recycled content at all, it's virgin material. Other times it's a completely different percentage share than what was expected. So getting to know your supply chain, tracing your materials from when they enter the supply chain can really help you understand these type of data points that can feel quite daunting at the moment. So I think what's really key, all this data exists somewhere. It existed when that recycled nickel first entered the supply chain, but then it was lost. And what the Battery Passport is helping us do is make sure that that data can be collected and shared with whoever it's relevant for to help them make more informed decisions. But then to make sure that decision is an empowered one, I think it's crucial to get really primary granular data and evidence to underpin any claims. Similarly to the battery carbon footprint, increases in stringency, if you like, or the targets increase. So first of all, it's just declaring what the recycled content is. Then there are targets put in place. So the first declarations are 2028, then in 3 years after that, there are targets, and then 4 years after that, those targets actually jump up and increase. Then there's also other information here about the role of end users and waste prevention and management as well, and information on battery waste collection, second life preparation and recycling. So really making sure the other end of the value chain is informed and able to follow the best practices in end-of-life battery. The last section is all about performance and durability parameters. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 40 of the 90 data attributes are related to performance and durability parameters. Today, little information is shared between actors of the value chain about performance and durability. There's also not many standards that for the evaluation of these parameters. So it can be quite hard to compare batteries in this area. It includes both static and dynamic data. So it could be, for example, the initial internal resistance on the battery model or the battery pack level is a static piece of data that will be common for all battery models. And then there's what the current internal resistance is on the battery model level. And that's dynamic, and that needs to be updated as we go. So that covers sort of the this also includes state of health, which is a really, really key metric that I think there's probably a deep dive or a panel session or something just covering that one metric at the moment. But that covers sort of the overview on the 90 data attributes that are mandatory for the EU battery regulations. There's also a lot of other data that can be collected, and there's no harm in collecting more data if it has value, if it's important, if it can help inform a decision, or if an organization wants to go above and beyond, for example, in sustainability reporting type metrics too. And hopefully what has come across is that where this data is coming from, it's a mixture, but it does involve quite a lot of data from the supply chain, or at least in order to be confident in the data that's being presented, especially that being made available to the public, for example, it's backed up with data, with a traceability system, with understanding and knowing and being confident in where that data is coming from. So I thought I would share, well, great to hear we've already got a few questions, but sometimes it can go quiet. So I thought I'd share just a few lessons learned. I've said we're founded in 2017. We've been doing material traceability, working with supply chains and supply chain traceability for a while. So we're getting to know that sort of data that's underpinning. And also now are, of course, in the digital battery passport area too. I thought I'd share just a couple of learnings because it might help ignite some questions, or it could just be interesting for you to leave the day with. So firstly, it just does need to be stated that the technology and the willingness to share, it is already in place. We have been tracking and tracing materials and products for a number of years now, and we do see a growing willingness of value chain participants to share data. We see an increased understanding of why needs to be shared, what it is that needs to be shared, and how, by working with somebody like Circular, for example. But there still needs a lot of focus and attention, and it is ongoing, and it will probably continue for a while, on finalizing underlying methodologies and calculations for specific data requirements, such as the battery carbon footprint, to make sure it's comparable, but also a continuation of the driving of international harmonization of standards on things like data models, which is ongoing. We're part of Patina X, Gaia X. We are the demonstrator in the Battery Pass project as well. So there's a lot going on, but it is already happening as well, which might be nice to know. But it isn't only a data sharing exercise. So I was obviously here today to deep dive into the data, talk a bit about where it comes from, maybe made it sound too simple, you just get it from your supply chain. It's not only a data sharing exercise, in that supply chain engagement is really key. And establishing digital connections between supply chain participants is required to collate battery passport data, and this does take time. It's not really, really easy, but we have experience, we know where to start, we know how to go about it, and we do know that starting early can provide a bit of a competitive advantage as well. And it is by building those strong relationships with suppliers who understand or complying with the regulations can also help with securing manufacturers that you trust, or securing sustainable sources of materials, components, ultimately resources. And lastly, beyond the regulation, which is often the kind of most talked about driver, there's a lot more business value awaiting through traceability and through doing this. I think also the regulation isn't just CU regulation. This is a global supply chains, global world. There's a lot of regulations that are requiring getting to know this type of data from your supply chain, having the intelligence, but it can help provide a lot of more benefits. And I think a similar slide was presented if you're in the panel earlier, so I will be brief so we can spend the next 10 minutes with questions. But for example, a mine may be able to prove reliable verification of ESG factors if that mine wishes to do so, or R&D teams, maybe there's some of you from them here, but from cell and module manufacturers, they've now got this feedback loop of real data, primary data about how the product was actually used, where it was used, maybe the location interfered with certain features. That can help inform sustainable design, sustainable manufacturing as well. And I think I was listening to a panel earlier where there was a recycler who was talking about how they get to be both data consumers and also sharing data, which I guess is key to this value chain of digitization. But that data would really help with informing decisions that they can't currently make. And help with segregating waste streams and just understanding more what is in this product I'm dealing with, how I should be handling it as well. Then I guess maybe lastly, we've all come from our respective companies, industries, but we are also all consumers. And if we think beyond batteries, this is going to be applying to many, many products. This should hopefully be helping us as consumers make informed decisions about our products, and if we're able to do so, moving beyond just the price tag and looking at the impact on the environment of that product, comparing the products in terms of their impact too. So thank you for listening, for joining the deep dive. I know we've got time now to jump into questions. But I just want to end by saying if you or your organization are facing challenges perhaps around battery passports or getting this data or understanding it or the regulations, essentially, where do I start? Just get in touch with us. We can talk and share experiences and help you engage with the stakeholders, perhaps internally, you need to as well. So do get in touch too. I'll stop sharing, and then I think I can also see.
You'll be able to see the questions then
as well. Yeah,
nice. Yeah, we've got about 17 questions.
Okay,
you've got a great engagement for your session, Nikki, and it's the most highly attended deep dive as well. So well done.
We won.
Yeah, it's all about winning. So I've asked the audience to vote for the questions they'd like answers to the most, just as a way of sort of prioritizing, seeing as we've got about 8 or so minutes left.
Yeah.
How does the question from Suraj sound? I'll call it out. As part of supply chain due diligence, what is the expectation from logistics and supply chain providers? Examples, conditions during storage and distribution of batteries.
Yeah, it's a really great question. We do track circular materials, and especially the emissions of what's happening in the transport part and the logistics, because it is really, really key. For the due diligence requirements on the battery regulations, I would say take a look at them specifically. They're a lot broader than just the due diligence report that's required for the battery passport. I know in that report, there's not an expectation from the logistics providers, but it might be covered more broadly in the article that covers due diligence in the regulations, if that helps. There's also, again, there's what the regulation requires, and then there's, do you, Suraj, get value out of that data? Do you think it's a useful piece of data to be collecting? Should we be collecting more data on the conditions during storage and distributions? I'd be really interested to know what happens to them, and could that be useful? So there's also data we can collect beyond what the regulations are asking us to comply with.
Great. We've got 4 thumbs up for another one of Nathan's questions. So Nathan asks, how much will the passport cost companies as part of the supply chain?
Yeah, so it's a great question. If you want to know how much it would cost you to work with us, I'd say get in touch and chat with our commercial team. There isn't a cost on how much it will cost. The economic operator is responsible for the battery passport, is responsible for putting if they're the ones that are placing the battery in the market, so they'll likely be carrying the burden of the cost. So yeah, but the numbers I can't really share currently. Yeah.
And another question from Suraj, what if different players in the E2E value chain use different digital product passports? How would the E2E transparency be provided in such cases?
So I think, Suraj, what you're touching on is this concept of data and interoperability. And there's a lot of work going on. So when I mentioned one of the shared learnings, the technology's in place, data's being shared, digital product passport providers are coming out there, and obviously there'll be different ones using different providers. So what's really key is harmonizing and creating the standards to allow that to be shared. We're ready to share with anyone that wants to. We're also expecting, digital product passports along the whole supply chain. So you could have digital cell passports, digital module passports, if there's repairs happening, switching in and out. So there's a lot of work going on in the background for standardizing these type of data models. All the data needs to be machine readable, et cetera, but to facilitate this sort of thing, which we will expect to happen and we need to understand.
We've got a question here from Victor. Victor, how will the product traceability give asset protection against illegal swapping and theft?
So perhaps I can say that with traceability, one of the use cases is with counterfeit products, for example. Illegal swapping and theft, I think what's key is there's more data available. It's uniquely available to that battery. We'll have that ID registered somewhere. And then if that comes up and is swapped and theft, and we can take a look at that ID, we can scan that QR code, we can understand all the data we have to date. It's a really interesting use case. I haven't seen it in play. I think it's one of the ones that we'll learn as we do, but just having the data, the unique ID, having it there, having traced it, I think will help us in this area. But how we go about doing it, I think as an industry will be really, really interesting to figure out.
And if we could go for one more question, maybe two, let's see. Another one from Nathan, it's got quite a few votes. How is the process of data gathering overcoming country-specific regulations around data sharing, industry information, and competition laws?
Yeah, it's a great question again. Wish we could chat here for hours. So data is being shared now. There are obviously new regulations coming out from different countries that are specific. There's a really strong industry growing that we can all work. I think it's a classic one where we all need to work together to understand and to make sure different areas and regions are getting value from this data, understand why it needs to be shared and benefiting from it. But to date, like I said, we are collecting data, we are sharing data. It is currently happening, but as and when something pops up, we'll address that, understand it, and we're at the edge. It's a very exciting place to be, but it does mean there's a lot going on at once. So we just have to make sure we keep up to date and help inform benefits and value of doing it too.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Nikki. I think that's probably about enough questions for now, just seeing as we've got a few seconds left. Would you like to sign off with a little message or a holding message for the group?
Yeah, just to say thanks again to Battery Associates. I think you've gathered just an amazing group of panelists, attendees to come join. Really great that there were free tickets as well, so that it was open to one and all. But essentially, get in touch with us. We love the battery industry. We're very happy and open to share our experiences, and we can help you understand this quite complex area and just get going, help you understand where to start, really. So thanks for joining and hope to speak with you soon.
Thank you, Nikki.